Well, we finally have some nonpartisan information on raising the minimum wage, and I think people on both sides will be very happy and very confused. I'm Scott Ott, and this is Bill Whittle Now. And Bill, the Congressional Budget Office, a nonpartisan organization tasked with analyzing the impact of legislation or proposed legislation in Congress, has said that going to a $15 federal minimum wage would likely boost pay for 27 million U.S. workers, lifting 1.3 million households out of poverty. And oh, by the way, would cost 1.3 million jobs. And this is what I mean, Bill, by it's going to make people on both sides of the aisle happy. You know, the federal minimum wage right now since 2009 has been $7.25 an hour. And if you're in a profession like waiting, being a service person, it's $2.13 an hour since 1996 because they take into account that you're going to be receiving some tips.
Yeah, but $2.13 an hour is basically. Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, exactly. So, Bill, let me start off because I know you may be one of those conservatives who doesn't think that Congress should even be having a conversation about how much an hourly pay should be for anybody. But don't you agree that $7.25 an hour for the last 10 years needs to change?
Well, yes, it does need to change. The question is, how is it going to change? And there's a right way to change things and a wrong way to change things. As I recall, when I started working, I'm pretty sure the minimum wage was $2.15 an hour. So 50 years ago, I was making what a waiter makes today. That's just nuts. But look, the cost of living increases. Inflation causes things to cost more money than they do. You cannot get by on $2.15 an hour these days, even as a rogue teenager. So the question then is, what do you do about this? Have you been to McDonald's and seen those ordering kiosks where you just walk up and just touch the buttons?
I've been to a lot of places and seen those.
Okay. Well, the reason those are there is because when this push for the $15 minimum wage happened, businessmen took a look at the math, as they always do. Businesses are not required to do anything other than satisfy the needs of their customers and provide a profit for the people who are putting their lives into this business, what you do with your life. So when you find out that hiring a person at $15 an hour is going to cost more money than the initial capital investment of a couple of touch screens, then you end up buying the touch screens and you end up not hiring the person. And as the minimum wage gets higher and higher, it's going to cost them. I know this is very difficult to follow, progressives, but just stay with me on this. If you mandate that somebody has to pay employees more and more and more, there's going to come a point where they're going to say, it is cheaper for me to do this thing, to buy this automated ordering kiosk, or automated burger flippers, or automated fry stations, or whatever. And when that happens, you put people out of work. And this is the problem with dictating the minimum wage. First of all, dictating a national minimum wage just in itself is a forget all the perfectly good and very important moral reasons to not have the government do this. Just think about it for a second. A $15 minimum wage for everybody. Okay, well, whatever the number is, it doesn't matter. It's nuts to say that a person who's working at a McDonald's in rural Mississippi, and I love rural Mississippi, needs the same income as somebody who's doing the exact same job in San Francisco or Washington, D.C.
There's actually a Democrat legislator in Alabama who's taken that into account and introduced an alternative to a raise the wage bill that was introduced in January. In April, Representative Terry Sewell introduced an alternative bill that would take into account regional differences.
Okay. But put that aside. I found it's been my experience generally that if you want to make an argument a little clearer, you need to take the actual argument and just turn it up a little bit. So for the people that think that the government should mandate $15 an hour, my question then becomes, well, why not 20? In fact, why not 50? In fact, why not 100? Why not make the government force businesses pay employees $100 an hour? Why wouldn't you do that?
There's an interesting argument being made here because there's research on both sides of this. For example, the University of California at Berkeley had a study that looked at local municipalities that changed their minimum wage laws, and their study said that basically they had zero impact on employment. In other words, standard of living was increased for those workers who received more pay, but it was not at the cost of jobs. The Congressional Budget Office, however, looked at 11 different studies, and their evaluation doesn't necessarily contradict the Berkeley study, but they said, look, there's a good chance that no jobs will disappear. However, there's also a good chance that 3.7 million jobs will disappear. So we're going to take the median number and say that 1.3 million jobs will disappear. This is the way science is done at the congressional level.
Yeah, and nobody knows how many jobs will actually disappear, but let's come back to the argument. You just sometimes people who are ruled by emotions need to have the reason cranked up to 11 so that they can see the problem. So again, I'm asking, if your claim is that the federal government should by law force a business to pay an employee a certain number, why are you stopping at 15? Why not make them pay them $100 an hour? Why not? You're playing the progressive. It's your turn to answer.
I'm the one who asked the questions on this show.
No.
Why don't you pass a law? Under your scenario, there is no reason why not to do that, because the person who is positing that has not taken into account the expense of operating a business and the fact that businesses exist to produce a profit for their investors.
And also not included in this by the people who are making these kind of demands. The people who are making these demands look at business owners and think, my God, they're just rolling in money. I don't know what the average margin is for a small business. It's got to be maybe 2-3% profit, something like that. Some small businesses actually operate at a negative profit. But anyway.
Well, I actually work for another company whose goal is 5 cents.
Okay.
5 cents on the dollar.
Okay.
And they're not there.
Right. So this idea that, we charge somebody $1 for a hamburger and it costs us, 3 cents, and we keep the 97 cents, just put in a big pool of money we go dive in after work is just plain not true. But I keep coming back to this $100 an hour argument because that becomes it suddenly becomes clear. For people who think that $15 an hour is not much of a reach, this $15 an hour minimum wage has a nice feel to it. But the point I'm making is that you have to look at it from the side of the people who are actually going to write those checks. And by legislating $15 an hour as minimum wage, you are forcing them to make a calculation that they didn't have to make before. And the best way to figure out what the result of this calculation would be is to imagine that rather than setting the law at 15, you set it at $100 an hour. If McDonald's had to pay every single employee $100 an hour, here's the question. This is the question. If McDonald's had to pay every single McDonald's employee $100 an hour, would the total amount of money flowing into people who are doing minimum wage jobs go up or down? Undoubtedly, McDonald's would have to keep 1 or 2 people in there at $100 an hour, but at $100 an hour, the cost of automating everything becomes cheaper than paying that. And so a McDonald's that might have hired 30 people before now maybe hire 4. So the question is 4 people making $100 an hour better than 30 people making $12.50 an hour?
Once the Democratic legislation, the Raise the Wage Act, gets that federal minimum wage up to $15 an hour, which, by the way, is slated to take place by 2024. So it wouldn't be a sudden jump from $7.25 up to $15. But then the idea is to index that to something like the median wage in the country, so that every time the median wage went up, minimum wage would automatically go up, so we're not relying upon Congress to raise the federal minimum wage. Bill, doesn't that make some sense, rather than making it a political football and putting the hands of, putting very relatively poor people into the hands of politicians who vote for reasons other than the good of society?
I'm glad you bring that up, because this brings to mind a really terrific example of how politicians think that they're smarter than all of the rest of the people put together. Just allow me a very quick little diversion here. In California, it was illegal to own an AR-15. And one of the reasons that it was illegal was because the AR-15 has, quote, a detachable magazine, unquote. So lawyers for the good guys said, well, what's the definition of detachable magazine? And the government responded by saying it's a magazine that you can't detach without the use of a tool. Okay, so they manufacture something called a bullet button, which is instead of just a little latch that drops the magazine out, you have to put something like a tool, like the tip of a bullet, or people selling rings with a little extension there. You do that. Now you drop the magazine out. And my point is this. They are trying to legislate away something, and whenever they make a definition of what that is, somebody out there gets smart enough to find a way to circle around this. So here's what's going to happen, Scott. If they continue to make it impossible, or at the very least so much of a burden to hire people, then what you're going to see in the very near future is you're going to see McDonald's start hiring people as independent contractors. And all of the benefits that they may get otherwise are simply not going to happen because they can't afford to do $100 an hour. Now, whatever that number is, if the government continues to do this, if the government thinks that this is just essentially an endless supply of stuff that just comes down from heaven like manna, and we can take as much as we want to without affecting anything, well, what's going to happen is, as it becomes more and more expensive and more difficult, that's actually worse even as a person who runs a small business. Well, can't really say runs it, but you get the general idea. As it becomes more and more difficult to hire an employee, employers will do what they're already doing, which is saying, since you made these rules that I cannot abide by and stay in business in order to show what a virtuous person you are and to come back to your constituents with the bacon, since I cannot match this, now my choice is to either go out of business or do something different. So what I'm going to do is the people who I used to have as employees, who I was paying into their health care costs for and all the rest of it, I can't afford that anymore. If I pay that, I'm out of business. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make them independent contractors, and all of the benefits that they had before are going to go away because somebody in a legislature someplace decided that this looked good.
I was at a big box store the other day and was surprised to find out after I made a purchase that the receipt I got for the purchase did not come in the name of the big box store. In fact, I later found out that about a third of that building, which I perceived to be under the rubric of this famous brand name, was actually being operated by a completely different company I'd never heard of. And then I realized that also not only were the appliances and the sound equipment and the TVs being sold by a different entity, but also there was a maintenance operation for computers that's kind of under a different rubric. And the whole middle of the store is taken up by cell phone sales that are each being operated according to the carriers of those cell phone companies. And so in reality, as far as I could tell, as far as square footage goes, the vast majority of the store was not the store that I saw the name on the sign out front.
And so what ends up happening here? I'm gonna go ahead and credit the people behind this with good intentions. I don't personally believe that, but I don't have evidence to the contrary, so I'm going to credit them with good intentions. They're trying to help people who are struggling with low-income jobs, and they think this is a way that's going to help them. But you really do have to ask yourself, after all of the evidence that's been amassed, and we were talking about this happened in Seattle, I want to say it was a couple years ago, and this is when we first heard about mandatory $15 an hour wage, and all of these businesses closed, and McDonald's started automating things. It's not like we don't have any evidence of what happens. And so if your position is that I'm doing this for the good of the poor, and there is a great deal of evidence on the table that says this actually harms the poor by taking away opportunities for them, then at some point you're either evil or an idiot. And just because you're one doesn't mean you're not the other as well. But you can no longer stand behind this shield of I'm doing this for poor people when all of the available evidence in front of all of our eyes is that it's not only not helping poor people, it's hurting them. And it's hurting them so that you can feel better about yourself and so that you can continue to get elected in order to exercise your will over other people. And I find that a bit repugnant, personally.
To finish up this episode and to address that very point that you just brought up, Bill, the lead author of the Raise the Wage Act, Representative Bobby Scott, a Democrat from Virginia, said that in the wake of the CBO report revealing that 1.3 million jobs would disappear, even though 1.3 million people would be lifted out of poverty, that they have 200 votes to pass the Wage Act, and all of them are Democrat votes, and that the CBO report doesn't change anything. And in fact, here's a quote from Representative Scott. What the report makes clear is that the benefits vastly outweigh any costs. I am confident that the votes are there.
Okay. This is why I like the idea of federalism. I think this is great. What state was he from?
Virginia.
Yeah. They're not quite far south enough to know better. Okay, so great. Virginia can mandate these laws. This is the laboratory of ideas that the United States should be. If you don't like gambling in your neighborhood, that's great. But if you want to live a life without taxes and make a lot of money, then become Nevada and make it legal. This is how it's supposed to.
So you're saying that Congressional Representative Bobby Scott should talk to his state representatives and tell them that they need to pass this legislation and leave the federal level alone.
Precisely. And so then look, the beautiful thing about this is maybe he's right. He's not right, but maybe he's right. And if he's right, then it'll work. And if it works, then Virginia will be attracting higher quality workers. Businesses will be thriving and growing because there'll be more money to spend and all the rest of it. If he's right, then I'll change my mind. I really will. If it turns out that this is the best way for the most number of American people to be happy without resorting to crime, then I am for it. If he can live up to this and say, look, we raised the minimum wage to this, and the total number of dollars that went out to people in need increased dramatically, despite the fact that there are fewer jobs, whatever the case may be, I'll at least sit and listen to it. But I don't think he's right, and I don't think he's right for reasons that are the same as the rules for gravity. They're tough laws to break. Maybe he can pull it off, but if they do it, and if it does start to look like the numbers are good, I just want to make sure there's no outside system coming into this little entropy loop. I want to make sure that this actual success is contained within the act, and not because they also added some other tax that adds a few $1 billion to this thing in order to make it look like everybody's doing better. So if Virginia wants to do this, Virginia, go knock yourself out. I live in the People's Republic of California. I don't know what the minimum wage here is. I think it's 11. It might be almost 12, maybe even higher now. I don't know. It's changing by the hour. But that's a decision I make. And if I want to save a lot of money, I can go live somewhere else. But, if you're going to be a volcanologist, you got to live under the volcano.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are grateful to the members at BillWhittle.com who, whether they're earning $15 an hour or $2.13 an hour or $45 an hour, have decided to devote some of their hard-earned dollars to this enterprise because they like these ideas and believe they should spread. We thank you to those people we thank, and also invite you to become one of them. You can do that by going to BillWhittle.com and clicking the Become a Member link. For Bill Whittle, I'm Scott Ott. Thanks to the members for making this happen.